Luke Dawson walked into the restaurant at 7:14 on a Thursday evening in Minneapolis. He scanned the room and started toward the back corner where Jill had told him his date would be sitting. A woman alone at a two-top. He spotted her immediately. She was looking down at her phone, one hand resting flat on the white tablecloth. He took 3 more steps before his feet stopped. He knew that posture. He had seen it through the glass wall of a conference room every Monday morning for 2 years. Natalie Haynes, Chief Executive Officer of Haynes Fleet Services, the woman who signed his paychecks. She looked up. The recognition crossed her face in the same half-second it crossed his. Neither of them spoke. Neither reached for a coat or turned toward the door. Jill's name had brought both of them to this table. When your blind date turns out to be the woman who runs your whole company, things get complicated in a hurry. Stay for this one. Luke's morning started the same way every weekday morning started. 5:45 alarm. Coffee brewed while the house was still dark. Lunch packed in a brown bag, sandwich and an apple, set on the counter next to a smaller brown bag with a juice box and a granola bar. By 6:30, he was standing at the bottom of the stairs calling up to his son. Ryan came down with his backpack already on, a paperback tucked under one arm. 8 years old, quiet in the way that sometimes concerned teachers, but never concerned Luke. The boy read everything he could reach and said what he needed to say, and nothing more. They drove to school in comfortable silence, Ryan turning pages in the passenger seat, Luke checking mirrors and sipping from a travel mug. After drop-off, Luke drove north on Interstate 35 toward the Haynes Fleet Services yard in Fridley. He parked between 2 box trucks, pulled on a pair of steel-toed boots he kept behind the seat, and walked through the bay doors into the smell of diesel fuel and brake cleaner and cold concrete. His title on the payroll said Mechanic 2. He worked on engines, transmissions, hydraulic systems. He was good at it. His shift lead, a man named Corbin who had been turning wrenches since before Luke was born, once told a new hire that if Dawson could not figure out what was wrong with the truck was done. Luke never corrected anyone who assumed this was all he had ever done. Before Haynes, he had spent 8 years at Harlan Automotive in Dearborn. Not on the shop floor. In the engineering division, 4th floor, corner office. Senior Automotive Systems Engineer. In 2018, he designed a diagnostic system called PDS, Predictive Diagnostic Suite, that translated sensor data into maintenance schedules with 96% accuracy across mixed commercial fleets. Harlan licensed it to fleet operators across 11 states. In 2022, Harlan restructured its North American R&D division. 41 engineers received termination letters on the same Tuesday in March. Luke was one of them. His wife Marie had died in a car accident on Interstate 94 11 weeks earlier. He was 35 years old with an 8-month severance package, a 3-year-old son, and a house that had become very quiet. He did not apply to other engineering firms. He found an opening for a fleet mechanic at a mid-sized company in the northern suburbs of Minneapolis, submitted a resume that listed his qualifications honestly, and was offered the position within a week. The salary was less than a third of what he had earned at Harlan. He took it without negotiating. Natalie Haynes had been running the company for 18 months. Her father, Gary Haynes, had founded Haynes Fleet Services in 1997 with 4 trucks and a lease on a corrugated metal building near the rail yard. By the time he died in 2023, the fleet had grown to 214 vehicles serving commercial clients across the upper Midwest. Natalie had worked in the business since college, starting in dispatch and moving through operations before her father named her president. When he died, she became chief executive officer at 33. Half the board had known her since she was a teenager sorting invoices in the back office. The other half measured every decision she made against what Gary would have done. Curtis Poole was the man they measured her against most often. Vice President of Fleet Operations, 19 years with the company. Curtis was 52, broad-shouldered, with a handshake that lingered half a second longer than necessary and a habit of beginning sentences with the phrase your father always said. He ran the maintenance division, the parts procurement pipeline, and the vendor relationships that kept 200 trucks on the road. Natalie needed him. She also understood that Curtis considered her temporary. The blind date was Jill Porter's idea. Jill was Natalie's older sister by 3 years, an elementary school teacher who lived in the Whittier neighborhood. She had been Luke's neighbor since he moved to the duplex on 32nd Street. She knew him as the quiet guy 3 doors down who shoveled her sidewalk without being asked. She knew her sister as a woman who worked 70 hours a week and had not been on a date in over a year. Jill mentioned Luke to Natalie by first name only. She mentioned Natalie to Luke the same way. A mechanic who worked at a garage up north. A younger sister who ran some kind of company downtown. Jill kept the details thin on purpose. That was the whole point of a blind date. They stayed. That was the first surprise. Luke pulled the chair back slowly, sat down, and set his hands flat on the table the way a person does when deciding whether to stay or stand. Natalie watched him without speaking. For a long moment, neither of them addressed what was obvious. Then Luke said, "Jill did not mention a last name." Natalie said, "No, she did not." That was all they needed to acknowledge. The rest of the evening they talked about things that had nothing to do with fleet operations or organizational charts. Neighborhoods. Books Ryan was reading that Luke could not keep up with. A cabin Natalie's father had built on a lake near Brainerd that she had not visited since he died. The conversation came easier than either of them expected, and that ease was its own kind of problem, because at 7 the next morning Luke would be under a truck in her maintenance bay, and she would be upstairs reviewing quarterly numbers, and neither of them would be able to pretend this dinner had not happened. Luke walked her to her car. The air was cold, and the parking lot was half empty, and their breath made small clouds under the overhead lights. He stood 3 feet from her, the same distance a person keeps when the other person is not quite a stranger and not quite anything else. Natalie opened her door, paused with one hand on the frame, and said, "Monday is going to be strange." Luke said, "Yes, it is." She got in. He waited until she pulled out of the lot, then walked to his truck and sat behind the wheel for a full minute before starting the engine. Monday morning, Luke arrived at the Fridley yard at 6:50. He changed into his coveralls, checked the board, and went to work. He did not look toward the second-floor windows. Natalie arrived at 7:15, walked past the bay on her way to the stairs, and did not look down. By noon, the silence between them had become its own kind of agreement. That afternoon, Natalie reviewed the quarterly maintenance cost report. She had flagged the numbers once before, 3 months earlier, and Curtis had explained the increase as supply chain inflation. The explanation had been reasonable, but something about the evening with Luke, the precision with which he described mechanical systems, had left her paying closer attention to precision everywhere. She pulled vendor files from procurement, invoices, purchase orders, approved supplier lists. Then she opened the personnel files for the maintenance division. When she reached the D's and saw Dawson, Luke T., she opened it. The application was 4 pages. Page 1 listed his name, address, and the position applied for. Page 2 was employment history. The first entry read Harland Automotive, Dearborn, Michigan, Senior Automotive Systems Engineer, 2014 to 2022. Below that, a summary that included the design and implementation of a predictive diagnostic platform adopted by commercial fleet operators in 11 states. The application had been processed by Curtis Poole. In the margin of the first page, in Curtis's handwriting, were 2 words and a classification code. Mechanic 2. Natalie set the file on her desk and did not move for a long time. Then she opened the company's technology licensing agreements. Haynes Fleet Services paid $180,000 per year to license a predictive diagnostic system called PDS from Harland Automotive Solutions. She clicked through to the technical documentation and found the original system architect listed on page 3, Luke T. Dawson. Her mechanic had designed the system her company paid 6 figures a year to use. And the man who had buried his qualifications was the same man who controlled every parts order and vendor contract in the building. That evening, Natalie drove home in silence. She did not confront Curtis. She did not call Luke into her office. What she had found was not yet a story she could tell. It was a shape, and she needed to understand what it contained before she held it up to the light. Over the next 2 weeks, Natalie began a quiet audit of the operations division. She requested vendor contract files from accounts payable under the pretext of preparing the annual budget review. She pulled 3 years of parts purchase records and sorted them by supplier, frequency, and unit cost. She cross-referenced approved vendor lists against state business registrations, looking for patterns she could not yet name. She worked on it early mornings before anyone else arrived, the parking lot empty except for her car and the security guards, and in the evenings after the administrative staff had gone. She told no one what she was looking for because she was not yet certain what she would find. What she knew was that a man with 8 years of engineering credentials had been classified as a mechanic too by a vice president who controlled everything that moved through the operations pipeline, and that the same vice president had approved every vendor contract and parts purchase in the building for nearly 2 decades. The first fact might have been an oversight. The second made oversight unlikely. At the Fridley yard, she watched Luke work. The conference room on the second floor had a window that overlooked the maintenance floor, and she found reasons to use it. On a Tuesday, she watched him diagnose a transmission fault on a Kenworth T680 that 2 senior mechanics had spent an entire shift failing to isolate. Luke opened the diagnostic port, ran the PDS interface on a company-issued tablet, cross-referenced 3 sensor readings against the service manual, and identified a failing solenoid in the valve body. 22 minutes. He did it the way a person reads a sentence in a language they wrote the grammar for. She watched him close the diagnostic program, wipe his hands on a shop rag, and move to the next truck without pausing. No one on the floor looked up. No one noticed what she had noticed, which was that Luke Dawson did not troubleshoot problems. He read them, the way a cardiologist reads an EKG, because he had built the machine that drew the lines. Curtis noticed the shift in Natalie's attention before anyone else did. He did not know what she was looking at, but he knew she was looking, and he knew that whatever it was had started after the Thursday night. She came back from dinner distracted and quiet. He began staying later than usual, his office door closed, the blue light of a monitor visible through the frosted glass. On a Wednesday afternoon, the server logs recorded a bulk deletion of 43 procurement files from the shared operations drive, executed from Curtis's workstation at 6:14 in the evening, 20 minutes after the last person in his division had clocked out. Luke noticed Natalie's presence differently. He caught her watching from the conference room window twice in 1 week, and each time she looked away a half-second too late. He assumed it was about the dinner, about the awkwardness of a blind date that had revealed itself as something that could not be repeated and could not be undone. He kept his distance. He did not go upstairs. He worked on engines and transmissions and told himself that the distance was professional and appropriate, and that the tightness in his chest when he saw her car in the parking lot each morning was just the cold air. The barbecue was Jill's doing. A Saturday afternoon in early December, the kind of cold that makes people stand close to the grill not because they care about the food, but because the heat feels good on their hands. Jill had invited 8 neighbors. She had also invited Natalie, without mentioning Luke, and placed 2 folding chairs next to the fire pit, where she knew proximity would do the work she was too polite to do with words. Ryan was there. He sat on the top step of Jill's front porch with his book, feet tucked under him, gloves on. He looked up once when Natalie walked past, gave her a small nod that was almost formal for a boy his age, and went back to reading. Luke watched the exchange from across the yard. He said nothing. By the fire pit, the conversation between Luke and Natalie moved the way it had at the restaurant, without effort and without the careful distance they maintained at the Fridley yard. They talked about Jill, about the neighborhood, about what it was like to keep working when grief made the work feel pointless, and then what it was like when the work started feeling real again. Luke came close to mentioning Harland. He started a sentence about something he had built once, a system that could read patterns in data the way a doctor reads a pulse, and then stopped mid-sentence. Natalie waited. He shook his head and said, "Some other time." She did not push, but she noticed the way his hands moved when he talked about building things, the unconscious precision of a man describing work that had once defined him, and she thought about page 3 of the PDS technical documentation and said nothing. On Monday, Luke found something that made some other time irrelevant. A shipment of brake rotors had arrived at the Fridley yard the previous Friday. The invoice listed them as OEM specification, original equipment manufacturer parts sourced through the authorized supply chain. Luke pulled one from the shelf, turned it over, and read the casting number stamped into the hub face. The number did not match any OEM catalog he knew, and Luke knew every catalog that mattered. He checked a second rotor. Same casting number. He photographed both, pulled the spec sheet from the manufacturer's database on his phone, and confirmed what he already suspected. The parts were aftermarket, mid-grade, functional but built to a lower tolerance than the OEM components the invoice claimed they were. The price on the invoice was OEM. The actual cost of the parts on the shelf was roughly 40% less. He brought it to his shift lead, Corbin, showed him the photographs, the spec sheet, the invoice discrepancy. Corbin looked at the evidence for a long time. Then he set the photographs down and said, "I have been here 26 years, and what I have learned is that some things are not worth finding." Luke did not respond. He put the photographs back in his pocket and walked to his toolbox. That evening, Luke sat at his kitchen table with the photographs spread in front of him and wrote a report. Not the kind of report a mechanic writes. The kind of report an engineer writes when the data points toward a conclusion that cannot be explained by accident or incompetence. He cross-referenced the casting numbers against 3 aftermarket parts databases and identified the actual manufacturer, a supplier in Elkhart, Indiana, that produced mid-grade replacement components for the secondary market. He calculated the price differential per unit. Then he pulled 6 months of brake rotor invoices from the purchase orders he had access to as a maintenance floor employee and laid them side by side on the table. Every invoice listed OEM specifications. Every invoice was priced at OEM rates. The markup on each one ran between 35 and 42% above the actual cost of the parts sitting on the shelf. He ran the math 3 times. Then he compiled the numbers into a single document with headers, comparison tables, and source citations, formatted it the way he had formatted engineering reports at Harland, printed 2 copies on the printer in the hallway, and placed them in a manila folder. He set the folder on the counter next to his lunch bag and went to bed. The next morning, he walked past the maintenance bays, up the stairs, through the administrative hallway, and into Natalie Haynes's office without knocking. She was at her desk. She looked up and saw him holding a manila folder, still in his work boots. He set it on her desk and said, "This is a safety issue." Natalie opened the folder and read the first page. Then the second. She read the way someone reads who has been waiting for a specific piece of information without knowing what form it would take. When she finished, she closed it and sat with both hands flat on the cover for a long moment. "How long have you known?" she said. "For days," Luke said. She nodded. He turned and walked out. Curtis Poole learned about Luke's visit to the CEO's office before lunch. By 2 in the afternoon, a formal written reprimand was sitting in Luke's personnel file. Unauthorized access to proprietary vendor records. Violation of operational chain of command. Recommendation for termination pending review. Curtis walked the document to Natalie himself. He set it on her desk and stood in front of her with his hands clasped behind his back. He said the issue was not the parts. The issue was protocol. A floor-level mechanic bypassing the division head to bring unverified claims directly to the chief executive was a breakdown of structure, and structure was what kept 200 trucks on the road. Natalie read the reprimand. Then she took a pen from her desk drawer, drew a single line through the signature block at the bottom of the page, and wrote the word rescinded above it in capital letters. She handed the document back to Curtis without looking up. He stood there for another moment, the paper in his hand, his weight shifting from left foot to right. Then he said, "Your father would not have let a mechanic walk into this office and dictate operational decisions." Natalie said, "My father also would not have let parts costs increase 31% in 2 years without an explanation that held up." Curtis left. He closed the door harder than necessary. Through the wall, Natalie heard him walk down the hallway, and then his own door opened and shut, and then there was silence. That week, Curtis began making phone calls. 3 of the 5 board members had known Gary Haynes personally, had attended his funeral, had told Natalie afterward that they would support her the way they had supported her father. Curtis called each of them. He did not discuss the parts report. He discussed leadership, judgment, the importance of experienced operational oversight in a company navigating a difficult freight market. He used the word transition twice. He used the word stability 4 times. He mentioned, in passing and without elaboration, that the new CEO had recently been seen having dinner with a maintenance floor employee at a restaurant in Uptown, and that the relationship between personal judgment and professional authority was something the board might want to consider as it planned for the company's next chapter. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of December, Fran Mosley knocked on Natalie's door. Fran was 62 years old, the senior parts coordinator at Haynes Fleet Services, and she had been ordering, receiving, cataloging, and filing parts purchase orders since before Natalie was born. 26 years in the same cinder block office behind the receiving dock, with a filing cabinet she had brought from home because the company-issued ones did not have enough drawer space. She carried a cardboard banker's box under one arm and set it on Natalie's desk without being invited to sit down. "I keep copies," Friend said. The box was full of paper. Purchase orders, receiving reports, vendor invoices, all filed chronologically in manila folders with handwritten dates on the tabs. Fran explained that she had maintained paper duplicates of every parts transaction since her first year at the company. She had once worked for a distributor in St. Paul that lost its entire digital records in a server failure in 1997 for $100,000 in unrecoverable billing data, and she had never trusted a system she could not hold in her hands. Every purchase order that crossed her desk got photocopied. Every receiving report got a carbon duplicate. She kept them in the filing cabinet in her office, organized by quarter and year, going back to 1999. The discrepancy Luke had identified in the brake rotors was not new. Fran had seen similar patterns for years, small mismatches between what the invoices described and what arrived on the shelves. She had mentioned it to Curtis twice, once in 2020 and once in 2022. Both times he had told her it was a supplier substitution issue, temporary, related to supply chain disruptions, and that he would handle it. Both times the invoices had continued unchanged. Fran had not raised it a third time. She was not the kind of person who repeated herself. She was the kind of person who kept a record. Natalie called Luke up from the maintenance floor. He arrived still wearing coveralls, the smell of transmission fluid on his hands. The three of them moved to the small conference room adjacent to Natalie's office, and Fran spread the contents of the box across the table. Purchase orders going back 5 years. Invoices from a company called Prairie Line Parts, LLC. 47 of them. Each one listing OEM specification parts at OEM prices. Each one bearing Curtis Poole's authorization signature. Prairie Line Parts LLC was registered in Woodbury, Minnesota, to a man named Tom Kinsey. Tom Kinsey was Curtis Poole's brother-in-law. The invoices from Prairie Line consistently billed for OEM components. The parts that actually arrived, documented in Fran's receiving reports with date stamps, lot numbers, and photographs she had begun taking in 2021 after Curtis dismissed her concerns the second time, were aftermarket parts purchased at wholesale rates from secondary suppliers in Indiana and Ohio. The difference between the invoiced price and the actual cost of the parts delivered, calculated across 47 transactions over 60 months, totaled $1,900,000. Fran placed one more document on the table, the PDS licensing agreement. She had filed the original copy when Gary signed it in 2020. She opened it to the technical appendix, page 3, and placed her finger on the system architect line. Luke T. Dawson. She looked at Natalie and said, I filed his original application when he came in 3 years ago. I know what Curtis wrote in the margin. Then she turned to Luke. I have known who you are since the day you walked through the bay doors with a resume that said Senior Systems Engineer and a badge that said Mechanic 2. I was waiting to see if you would do something about it. The conference room was quiet. Luke looked at the licensing page with his name on it and understood that Natalie had found this weeks ago, had carried the knowledge silently while she built her own audit, had watched him from the conference room window not because of the dinner, but because she already knew what he was and was trying to understand why he had let himself be buried. Natalie looked at the procurement evidence spread across the table and understood that Luke had been building toward this from the moment he turned that first brake rotor over and read the casting number. Neither of them said anything about the knowing. The evidence was the conversation now, and it was louder than anything they could have said to each other. The board meeting was held on the second Wednesday of January. Natalie had spent 3 weeks preparing the presentation with the help of an independent forensic accountant she hired to verify Fran's records against the company's digital transaction history. The accountant confirmed the $1.9 million discrepancy and identified 12 additional transactions that Fran's paper records had not captured, pushing the total to just over $2.1 million. Luke prepared a separate technical analysis showing that the aftermarket parts substituted for OEM components on 14 vehicles had reduced braking performance by margins that fell below federal DOT standards for commercial vehicles over 26,000 pounds. Curtis arrived at the meeting in a dark suit. He sat at the far end of the table with a leather portfolio in front of him and his phone face down beside it. He did not know the specific contents of the agenda. He knew only that Natalie had called an emergency session and that 3 board members had stopped returning his calls. Natalie presented the findings methodically. The Prairie Line invoices. The parts substitution evidence. The Woodbury registration linking the shell company to Tom Kinsey. The 5-year timeline. The forensic accountant's summary. The PDS licensing agreement and the personnel file showing that Curtis had classified the system's original architect as a mechanic too. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She laid the documents on the table and let them speak. Curtis questioned the source. He questioned the methodology. Then he leaned forward and said, "Before this board makes any decision based on this presentation, I think it is worth noting that the chief executive officer has been personally involved with the employee who produced this analysis. She has been dating a mechanic on the shop floor, and the objectivity of this entire process is compromised." The room was silent. A board member named Aldrich, who had served since 2012, picked up the forensic accountant's report, turned to the summary page, and said, "The numbers are independently verified. The personal characterization is not relevant to the financial findings." She set the report down. The vote was 5-1. Curtis Poole was removed as vice president of fleet operations effective immediately. The board authorized Natalie to refer the matter to the Minnesota Attorney General's office for investigation of procurement fraud. Curtis stood, collected his portfolio and phone, and walked out of the conference room. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it was. Natalie found Luke in the hallway outside. He was standing near the window in the same work shirt he had worn to the meeting because no one had told him to wear anything else. She stopped 3 feet from him. The phrase dating a mechanic on the shop floor occupied the space between them like something that had been true and insufficient at the same time. Luke looked at her and said, "He was not wrong." Natalie said, "No, he was not." Neither of them moved. Luke put his hands in his pockets and looked out the window at the parking lot where the January light was flat and gray and the trucks sat in their rows like machines waiting to be told what to do. Natalie stood beside him. After a while she said, "Thank you." Luke nodded. He walked back toward the stairwell. She went to her office and closed the door. The weeks after the board meeting moved at a different speed. The urgency that had defined the previous 2 months, the quiet audits, the late nights, the manila folders and bankers' boxes, gave way to something steadier and less dramatic. Natalie hired a new operations manager from outside the company, a woman named Torres who had spent 15 years in fleet management at a national carrier and who asked the kind of questions about vendor contracts that Curtis had spent 19 years making sure nobody asked. Fran Mosley was promoted to Procurement Compliance Coordinator, a title that had not existed before and that Natalie created specifically because Fran had proven she could not be fooled by a clean digital record. Fran accepted the promotion without ceremony. She moved her filing cabinet to a larger office near the executive suite and continued keeping paper copies of everything. The aftermarket parts were replaced across all affected fleet vehicles. 14 trucks received new OEM brake components. The DOT compliance reports were updated and filed. Within the first quarter after Curtis's departure, maintenance parts costs dropped by 31%. 3 clients who had been evaluating alternative fleet providers renewed their contracts early, citing improved vehicle reliability as the deciding factor. Luke continued working on the maintenance floor. Nothing about his daily routine changed. He arrived at the Fridley yard at 6:50 each morning, checked the board for his assignments, and spent his shifts under the hoods and chassis of trucks that needed him. The difference was that Natalie now knew who was doing the work, and the other mechanics were beginning to notice that the CEO visited the floor more often than she used to. In February, Natalie offered Luke the position of Director of Fleet Engineering. It was a role that matched his actual qualifications, carried a salary commensurate with his experience, and placed him in the organizational structure 3 levels above the maintenance floor. She made the offer formally, in her office, with a written job description and a compensation package printed on company letterhead. Luke read it carefully. He asked 2 clarifying questions about reporting structure, both of which had the same answer. The Director of Fleet Engineering reported to the Chief Executive Officer. He set the offer on her desk and said he needed to think about it. That Friday evening they met at the same restaurant. The same table. The hostess recognized them and seated them without comment. The bread basket arrived before they ordered. Luke sat with the offer letter folded in his jacket pocket and talked about the Brainerd cabin, about whether Jill had known all along and was simply more patient than either of them, about February on the lake when the ice was thick enough to walk on and the silence was so complete you could hear the wood in the dock contracting with the cold. The conversation was easy. The offer letter was not. What he could not say, and what she already understood, was that accepting the position meant she would remain his superior. The hierarchy that had shaped every interaction between them from the first day he walked into the Fridley yard would continue, formalized at a higher level, but structurally unchanged. He would report to her. She would evaluate his performance. Every decision she made about his work would carry the weight of whatever existed between them, and every conversation they had outside of work would carry the structure from inside it. He did not want to be her employee. He did not want to stop seeing her. Those two facts could not occupy the same office. On a Saturday morning in late February, Luke sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a laptop open to a blank document. The cursor blinked against the white screen. Ryan was on the couch in the next room, socked feet tucked under a blanket, reading a book about a boy who sailed across the Pacific. The house was warm and quiet, the kind of Saturday morning that felt like it had always existed and would continue to exist exactly this way for as long as Luke let it. He looked over at his son for a moment. Ryan turned a page without looking up, absorbed in a world that was bigger and more dangerous and more beautiful than the living room he was sitting in. Luke watched him and thought about what it meant to build something, not a system or a protocol or a diagnostic suite, but a life, from the ordinary materials of a kitchen table and a Saturday morning and a boy who read books while the coffee got cold. He had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. The offer letter was still in his jacket pocket, folded in thirds, the crease lines deepening every time he took it out and read it again. The salary was generous. The title was appropriate. The scope of responsibilities matched everything he had spent 8 years at Harlan learning to do. It was the right job in the wrong structure, and he had spent enough years inside structures to know that the wrong one would eventually break something that mattered more than a paycheck. Ryan set his book down later that morning and wandered into the kitchen. He stood next to Luke's chair and looked at the table, which was covered in papers and a calculator and a coffee mug with a ring on the bottom from sitting too long. He did not ask what any of it was. He said, "Are we going to Jill's later?" Luke said, "Maybe tomorrow." Ryan nodded. He went to the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of milk, and started back toward the couch. Halfway across the kitchen he stopped and said, without turning around, "Is Natalie coming?" Luke's hands paused on the keyboard. He looked at his son's back. Ryan was already walking away, the glass of milk steady in both hands. The question left behind him like something he had been carrying for a while and had finally set down in the most casual place he could find. Luke turned back to the laptop and began typing. By noon the document was finished. 1 page. He read it twice, changed 2 words, and printed it on the hallway printer. On Monday morning, Luke walked into Natalie's office and placed a sheet of paper on her desk. A consulting proposal. Dawson Engineering Services, LLC. Independent Contractor Agreement. Scope of work included predictive maintenance systems integration, fleet diagnostic optimization, and vendor compliance auditing. First client, Haynes Fleet Services. Fee structure, project-based with quarterly review. Reporting relationship, none. He would serve the company from outside its walls. He would answer to the work, not to her title. Natalie read the proposal without speaking. 1 page. Clean margins. No ornamentation. The work of a man who had spent 8 years writing specifications for systems that had to function without ambiguity. She set it down and looked at him. Luke stood with his hands in his pockets, the same posture he held when he was waiting for a diagnostic to finish running, patient and certain and not in a hurry. She said, "This is what you want." He said, "This is what works." Natalie looked at the proposal for another moment. Then she picked up a pen and signed the bottom of the page. 3 months later, Luke drove to the Haynes Fleet Services building on a Tuesday morning in April. The snow was gone. The trees along the frontage road had begun to bud, the pale green of early spring in Minnesota that lasted about 2 weeks before everything turned full and dark. He parked in the visitor section near the front entrance, not in the employee lot behind the maintenance bays where his truck had sat for 2.5 years. He walked through the front door carrying a laptop bag and a bound quarterly report. The receptionist said, "Good morning, Mr. Dawson, conference room 2. He nodded and walked down the same hallway he had walked 100 times before, but from the other direction now, and wearing a different badge. Natalie was already in the conference room. She stood when he entered, not because protocol required it, but because she wanted to. They shook hands across the table. The handshake lasted 1 beat longer than professional and one beat shorter than what they both wanted. They sat across from each other, 2 copies of the quarterly report between them, and spent 45 minutes reviewing fleet performance, diagnostic integration timelines, and vendor compliance scores. He presented findings. She asked questions. He answered with the specificity of a man who had designed the systems he was evaluating, and she listened with the attention of a woman who understood that the person across the table was no longer performing below his capacity. When the meeting ended, they walked to the lobby together. Natalie said, "Jill called this morning." Luke said, "I know. She called me too." "The restaurant," Natalie said. "Tonight. Same table." Luke said, "What did you tell her?" Natalie said, "I told her I would be there at 7. She paused. "Bring Ryan," she said. Luke looked at her. She was already turning back toward the hallway. That evening, Luke pulled into the restaurant parking lot at 6:50. Ryan was in the passenger seat, his book in his lap, his seat belt still fastened. Luke turned off the engine and sat for a moment. The restaurant windows glowed warm against the spring dark, the same amber light that had been in them the first time he walked through that door in November, when he had been a mechanic going to meet a stranger and had found his boss sitting at the table. Ryan looked up at him. Luke said, "Ready?" Ryan closed his book, tucked it under his arm, and opened the door. They walked in together. Natalie was already at the table. The same corner two-top, except tonight the hostess had pulled a third chair from somewhere and set it at the end. Ryan walked ahead of Luke, pulled the chair out, and sat down next to Natalie with the ease of someone who had been expecting this arrangement longer than either adult had. He set his book on the table beside the water glass. Natalie looked at the cover. "What are you reading?" she asked. Ryan turned it toward her. She studied the title and said, "That is a good one." Ryan almost smiled. Luke sat down across from them. The table was small. His knee touched the table leg. The menu was the same. The breadbasket was the same. The window behind Natalie showed the same stretch of Hennepin Avenue, the same line of parked cars under a spring sky that was finally, after 5 months of Minnesota winter, something other than gray. Everything was the same except that this time he had chosen to be here. This time no one had kept a name secret or withheld a detail or arranged a coincidence. Jill had called both of them and said the same place, the same time, and both of them had said yes without asking who else would be there, because they already knew, and knowing was the point. Natalie passed the breadbasket across the table to Ryan, who took a piece and set it on his plate and went back to his book. Luke watched them, the woman and the boy, separated by the width of a small table in a restaurant where 5 months ago he had walked in expecting a stranger and found someone he already knew. He reached for the menu. His hand brushed hers on the way. Neither of them pulled back. He sat down at the same table, in the same chair. This time, neither of them needed an introduction.